The blizzard descended like Judgment Day, turning the mountain pass into a howling void of white. Alone in her remote cabin, Abigail Thornwood heard the faint cries that no human should have been able to hear over nature's fury. Children lost. In the storm, frozen, terrified, abandoned to the merciless cold. She barely had enough firewood to last the winter, but somehow she found the strength to brave the killing frost. She thought they'd be claimed by their parents when the snow cleared. 1 week later, a line of horsemen appeared on the ridge, carrying intentions that no storm could ever conceal. The wind carried voices that night, hollow, mournful sounds that seemed to rise from the very bones of the mountains. Abigail Thornwood stood at the frost-etched window of her cabin, one hand pressed against the rough-hewn logs, her greying hair pulled back in a severe knot at the nape of her neck. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She knew that sound. Anyone who had survived 5 winters in Shadow Valley knew it. The voice of a blizzard, powerful enough to bury travelers alive, powerful enough to freeze a man's blood in his veins before he could find shelter. The sky had vanished hours ago. The moon, which should have been full and bright above the pines, had been devoured by swirling walls of snow. The forest that surrounded her small clearing had become a collection of dark spectres, thrashing and moaning as the wind tore through branches weighed down by ice. Abigail checked the fire one last time, murmuring a prayer her grandmother had taught her, and pulled her husband's old wool sweater tighter around her thin shoulders. She had no family to help her anymore, no neighbors who would venture up the treacherous mountain road, just her and the cabin her husband Marcus had built with his own hands before the consumption claimed him 3 winters past. And even the mountains were turning against her now. Abigail had been nearly 60 when Marcus died, too old to return to the town in the valley where whispers and sideways glances followed her like shadows. The cabin was all she had left. A final monument to a love that had endured decades of hardship. Most thought her mad for staying, especially after the mining company had offered good money for her land. But Abigail knew what they didn't. That some homes were worth more than gold, that memories sometimes dwelled in the grain of wood and the pattern of stone. The isolation had never bothered her. She had her books, her small garden in the summer, her jars of preserves for winter, and her late husband's fiddle that she played on nights when the silence grew too thick. The townsfolk left her alone, save for young Jamie, who brought supplies once a month in his father's battered truck. That arrangement suited Abigail just fine. People had never understood her, even before she became the widow on the mountain. This winter had been harsher than most. November had brought early snow, heavy and wet, that collapsed her storage shed and spoiled half her supplies. December had followed with ice storms that encased the trees in crystal and made the road impassable. January, now in its final week, had saved its worst for last. A blizzard so fierce that even the bears sleeping deep in their dens must have been stirring with unease. Abigail moved away from the window and eased herself into the rocking chair by the fire. The flames popped and hissed, sending shadows dancing across the cabin's single room. She had enough wood, at least. Marcus had always insisted on cutting twice what they needed, a habit she maintained after his death. Food was another matter. Her shelves held enough to last until spring, but only if she was careful, only if she measured each portion with precision. She was reaching for her knitting, a pair of socks she would never need but made just to keep her hands busy, when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, the way it sometimes seemed to carry fragments of conversation or distant music through the trees. But it came again, high and thin, barely audible. Beneath the blizzard's roar, the sound of a child crying. Abigail went still, the half-finished sock clutched in her gnarled hand. She had lived alone too long, she told herself. The mind played tricks when starved for company. She had learned that lesson well over the years. But there it was again, slightly louder, not one voice but several, calling out in frightened unison. Children's voices. She rose abruptly, ignoring the protest of arthritic knees, and moved to the door. No sane person would be out in such weather, let alone children. Perhaps it was a mountain lion. Their screams sometimes resembled a woman's cries, or so she'd been told. Or perhaps it was just the peculiar acoustics of the valley, carrying sounds from the town miles below. But deep in her chest, in the place, where a mother's instinct had once dwelled before time and grief hollowed it out, Abigail knew better. Someone was out there, lost in the howling whiteness. For a long moment she hesitated, one hand on the iron door latch. Opening that door meant inviting the killing cold inside, meant risking her own life on the slim chance that she hadn't imagined those cries. Sensible people would stoke the fire, perhaps leave a lantern in the window, and pray that was enough. But Abigail Thornwood had never been accused of being sensible. With a single sharp movement, she pulled the door open. The wind nearly tore it from her grasp, filling the cabin with swirling snow and bitter cold. Shielding her eyes with one arm, she peered into the storm. Nothing but white. White above, white below, white stretching into infinity. Then a flicker of movement. A darker shape against the snow, perhaps 30 yards from her door, the edge of the tree line where her clearing met the forest. Then another shape beside it, smaller still. "Here!" she shouted, her voice thin and feeble against the storm's fury. "Over here!" The wind devoured her words. The shapes remained huddled, unmoving. Cursing under her breath, Abigail retreated into the cabin. With trembling hands, she lit her strongest lantern and grabbed Marcus's old coat from its peg. It was far too large for her, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips, but it was the warmest thing she owned. She pulled on his boots as well, stuffing the toes with rags to make them fit, and wrapped a scarf around the lower half of her face. The lantern in one hand, a length of rope tied around her waist and secured to the doorframe, she stepped out into the storm. The cold struck like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Snow blinded her, ice crystals stinging any exposed skin. The wind pushed against her with such force that each step required conscious effort. She held the lantern high, its glow creating a small sphere of visibility in the whiteout. "Hello," she called again, her voice immediately swept away. "This way, follow the light!" Slowly, painfully, she made her way toward where she had seen the shapes. The snow was knee-deep in places, with hidden drifts that sometimes plunged her to her waist. Several times she nearly lost her footing, saved only by the rope that anchored her to the cabin. Then, as if the storm parted for just a moment, she saw them clearly. 3 small figures huddled together at the base of a large pine. Children, just as she had feared. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, a boy with his arms wrapped protectively around 2 smaller children who appeared nearly buried in the snow. Abigail fought her way to them, the lantern held out like an offering. As she drew closer, she could see that their lips were blue, their eyelashes crusted with ice. They wore woolen coats and hats, but nothing adequate for a blizzard of this magnitude. The smallest child, a girl with blonde braids, was no longer shivering, a dangerous sign that Abigail recognized immediately. "Can you stand?" she shouted to the oldest, a boy with dark eyes that seemed too large for his pale face. He nodded, though the movement was jerky, uncoordinated. "Take my hand. Hold on to each other. Follow me." The boy grasped her extended hand with fingers stiff as twigs. With his other arm, he held on to the middle child, who in turn clutched the smallest girl. Together they formed a human chain, with Abigail slowly retracing her steps, following the rope back to the cabin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The journey seemed to take hours, though it couldn't have been more than minutes. The children stumbled repeatedly. Twice, the smallest girl fell, and Abigail had to carry her, the child's slight weight almost nothing in her arms. The wind howled its fury, as if personally offended that she dared to snatch these lives from its grasp. When the cabin's outline finally appeared through the snow, Abigail felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. With her last reserves of strength, she ushered the children through the door and into the blessed warmth within, slammed the door shut against the storm, and sagged against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The children stood just inside the doorway, shivering violently now that they were out of the wind. Snow melted off their clothes, forming puddles on the plank floor. They huddled together, wide-eyed and bewildered, like wild creatures suddenly trapped. Abigail set the lantern aside and moved with purpose. First, the fire. She added 3 logs, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Then blankets, the thickest she owned, including the quilt from her own bed. Finally, she dragged the tin bathtub from its place near the washstand and set it close to the fire. "We need to get you warm," she said, her voice rough from the cold. "All of you, out of those clothes." The oldest boy hesitated, wariness mingling with the exhaustion on his face. "Who are you?" he asked, teeth chattering so violently the words were barely intelligible. "Abigail Thornwood, this is my cabin, and you're halfway to the grave with cold." She softened her tone. "I won't harm you, but we need to warm you up before the frost sets in your bones." While the water heated, she helped them out of their sodden clothes. The oldest boy managed on his own, though his fingers fumbled with buttons. The middle child, a boy of perhaps 8, needed assistance with his boots, which had frozen to his socks. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 5, was nearly catatonic, her small body icy to the touch. Abigail worked quickly, decades of mountain living having taught her the deadly urgency of cold. She rubbed their limbs with rough towels, checked fingers and toes for the grey-white patches of frostbite, and finally helped them into the tub one by one, the water warm but not hot enough to shock their systems. As feeling returned to their bodies, pain followed, the burning ache of extremities coming back to life. The little girl whimpered while the boys stoically endured, though tears leaked from the corners of their eyes. While they soaked, Abigail searched through her dresser and chest, finding shirts and trousers that had once belonged to Marcus. They would be enormous on the children, but they were clean and dry. For the little girl, she took one of her own flannel nightgowns and a pair of scissors, quickly cutting it down to size. By the time she had finished, the oldest boy was helping the others from the bath, wrapping them in the blankets she had laid by the fire. His dark eyes watched her warily, but with less fear now. The middle boy simply looked dazed, while the little girl had finally begun to shiver again. A good sign. "Can you eat?" Abigail asked, already moving to the stove. She didn't wait for an answer. Food was the next necessity after warmth. She built up the fire in the cook stove and set a pot of water to boil. From her dwindling stores, she took what she could spare: dried beans soaked since morning, a few wrinkled potatoes, half an onion, and a precious handful of salt pork. It wasn't much, but it would make a soup substantial enough to put some life back into them. As she worked, she felt the children's eyes following her movements. The oldest had positioned himself between her and the younger ones, his posture alert. Despite his exhaustion, the middle boy had drawn his knees to his chest, rocking slightly. The little girl had curled into a tight ball, her eyes already drooping with fatigue. "What are your names?" Abigail asked, her back to them as she chopped. The potatoes. The familiar rhythm of the knife against the cutting board was soothing, a counterpoint to the storm's continued assault outside. Silence greeted her question. Then, hesitantly, the oldest boy spoke. "I'm Thomas," he said. "That's William. And she's Grace." Abigail nodded without turning. "Brothers and sister?" "Yes, ma'am." "What in heaven's name were you doing out in this weather, Thomas?" Another silence, this one heavier. Abigail continued her work, giving him space to answer or not as he chose. She had lived alone long enough to understand the value of silence, the weight of unasked questions. "We were heading to Pine Ridge," he finally said. "To our aunt's house, our wagon. There was ice on the road. It went over the side." Abigail's hands stilled on the knife. Pine Ridge was on the other side of the mountain pass, a treacherous journey even in good weather. In a blizzard, with children on a wagon, it was nothing short of madness. "Your parents?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Our father was driving. He told us to climb up, away from the ravine, said he'd be right behind us." Thomas's voice cracked. "The wagon fell. We heard it. We called for him, but he didn't answer. We tried to go back down, but the snow was too deep and Grace was getting too cold." Abigail closed her eyes briefly. Another soul claimed by the mountains, another family shattered. "So you started walking," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am, I thought we could find help, but everything looks the same in the snow. We just kept walking until we couldn't anymore." The enormity of their situation settled over Abigail like a heavy cloak. 3 orphaned children, a storm that showed no signs of abating, and a cabin with barely enough supplies for one elderly woman. She looked down at the meager ingredients for the soup and wondered how she could possibly stretch them through the days ahead, but what choice did she have? She couldn't send them back into the storm, couldn't abandon them as fate had already done once today. "You were lucky," she said simply, returning to her chopping. "Another hour out there, and I wouldn't be talking to you now." "We heard your emviddle," the middle boy, William, said suddenly. His voice was higher than his brother's, with a slight lisp. "Through the trees. That's how we found you." Abigail turned, surprised. "My fiddle?" William nodded earnestly. "You were playing a song. It was sad but pretty. We followed it." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept up Abigail's spine. She hadn't touched Marcus's fiddle in days. It hung on the wall, untouched, gathering dust. These children, delirious from cold, must have heard the wind in the pines, or perhaps the distant howl of a wolf, but not a fiddle, not her fiddle. Yet something had led them to her door, to the one cabin for miles around. Whatever it was, Abigail wasn't going to question the providence that had saved 3 young lives. "Well," she said, turning back to the stove, "you're here now, and you're safe." As she stirred the soup, adding a pinch of precious dried herbs, Abigail tried not to think of the days ahead, of how quickly her food would disappear with 3 extra mouths to feed, of how the road would be impassable for weeks yet, of the father lying broken at the bottom of a ravine, out of reach, until the spring thaw. Instead, she focused on what she could control. The soup bubbling in the pot, the fire burning steadily in the hearth, the 3 children slowly warming by her fire, their eyes heavy with exhaustion and grief they were too young to fully comprehend. When the soup was ready, she ladled it into the 4 mismatched bowls that were usually more than enough for her solitary existence. She hesitated, then added an extra spoonful to each child's bowl, silently calculating how much longer her own portion would need to last. "Eat," she said, handing them each a bowl and a spoon. "Then sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure the rest out." The children ate without speaking, their movements slow and mechanical. Even the little girl, Grace, managed a few spoonfuls before her head began to nod. By the time they finished, all 3 were fighting to keep their eyes open. Abigail made a pallet of blankets near the fire, arranging them in a nest wide enough for 3 small bodies. Without prompting, the children curled together like puppies, Thomas in the middle with an arm around each sibling. "Thank you," he murmured, his eyes already closing. "For finding us." Abigail nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched. As sleep claimed them, their faces soft and vulnerable in the firelight. Children who had lost everything but each other, delivered to her doorstep by a storm that should have killed them. Later, sitting in her rocking chair with a thin blanket around her shoulders, Abigail stared into the dying fire. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside, the only sounds were the gentle breathing of the children and the occasional pop from the fireplace. She had saved them from the storm, but what came next? She was an old woman, living on borrowed time herself. What could she possibly offer 3 orphaned children? And yet, as she watched them sleep, something long dormant stirred in her chest. A purpose, a reason to continue that went beyond simple survival. The mountains had taken their father, but perhaps they had also, in their harsh way, provided a kind of salvation, not just for the children, but for her as well. Abigail adjusted the blanket around Grace's small shoulders and added another log to the fire. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For tonight it was enough that they were alive, that they were warm, that they were safe. Outside, the blizzard howled its fury, but for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. Morning arrived with reluctant light filtering through ice-glazed windows. The blizzard had relented somewhat, though fat snowflakes still swirled lazily beyond the glass. Inside the cabin, Abigail had been awake for hours, watching the children sleep as she silently took inventory of what remained in her modest stores. The truth was stark. With 4 mouths to feed instead of 1, her carefully. Ration supplies would be exhausted within 2 weeks. The path down to the valley might not be passable for twice that long. She would need to be creative, resourceful, and perhaps a bit lucky if they were all to survive until help could reach them. Thomas woke first, his dark eyes snapping open with immediate awareness, as if sleep was a luxury he couldn't fully trust. He carefully extricated himself from between his siblings and sat up, his borrowed clothes hanging from his thin frame like a scarecrow's garments. "Morning," Abigail said quietly, already at the stove where a pot of water heated for tea. The last of her real tea, she'd decided, a concession to the children's ordeal. "How do you feel?" "Better, Mom." His voice was still raspy from the cold, but stronger than the night before. "Thank you for—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything. The rescue, the shelter, the food. Abigail nodded, accepting his gratitude without comment. "Your brother and sister need more rest. Let them sleep. There's washing water in the basin if you want it, though it's cold." While Thomas washed his face and hands, moving with the deliberate carefulness of a child accustomed to adult responsibilities, Abigail prepared a simple breakfast. Cornmeal mush, sweetened with the barest drizzle of precious molasses. As she stirred, she surreptitiously studied the boy. He was perhaps 12, with a serious face and those striking dark eyes that seemed to notice everything. His hands, she observed, were already calloused. A working child then, not one of the pampered town children. There was an alertness to him, a watchfulness that spoke of hard lessons learned early. "Your wagon," she said, as she spooned the mush into bowls. "Did it carry supplies? Food?" Thomas nodded, joining her at the rough-hewn table. "Yes, Ma'am. Everything we owned. Father sold our farm after Mother died last spring. We were going to live with our aunt in Pine Ridge. She has a boarding house." The information settled between them, filling in pieces of the tragic puzzle. Abigail placed a bowl before him and sat with her own, considerably smaller portion. "And your aunt is expecting you." "Yes, Ma'am, but not until next week. Father wanted to take the mountain pass while the weather still looked fair." Thomas's expression darkened. The snow came faster than anyone said it would. Abigail knew this all too well. The mountain weather was fickle, murderous in its unpredictability. Even experienced travelers could be caught unaware. "The ravine where your wagon fell," she said carefully. "Could you find it again?" Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. Everything was white. We walked for so long." His voice cracked slightly. "Father told us to climb up. He said he'd follow, but then we heard the crash." Abigail saw the dawning realization in his eyes, the understanding that his father likely lay dead at the bottom of that ravine. She had seen that same realization in her own reflection after Marcus died. That moment when hope finally gives way to the crushing certainty of loss. "I need to tell you something, Thomas," she said quietly. "And I need you to be strong enough to hear it." The boy's jaw tightened, bracing himself. "We are in a dangerous situation. My supplies were meant for one person, not four. The road down to the valley will be blocked for weeks. Your father's wagon might have food, tools, things we desperately need." "You want to look for it," Thomas said, his voice flat. "I do, but I won't leave you children alone, and I can't drag your little sister through snowdrifts that could swallow her whole." Abigail met his gaze directly. "So we will wait a few days until the snow settles. Then, if you feel strong enough, you and I will try to find the ravine." Something flickered across Thomas's face, fear perhaps, but also a kind of grim resolve. He nodded once, a boy carrying a man's burden. A soft sound from near the fireplace interrupted them. William was sitting up, rubbing sleep from his eyes, while little Grace still slumbered beside him, her blonde braids splayed across the pillow. "Breakfast," Abigail said, the conversation with Thomas tucked away for later. "Come eat while it's warm." The rest of the morning unfolded in a series of quiet adjustments. The children, still weakened from their ordeal, moved tentatively around the cabin's confined space, careful not to touch anything without permission. Abigail, accustomed to solitude, found herself constantly aware of their presence, the sound of their breathing, the shuffle of oversized clothes, the way they whispered among themselves when they thought she couldn't hear. By midday, a fragile routine had been established. William, the middle child, proved to be more talkative than his brother once his initial shyness receded. He followed Abigail around the cabin, asking questions about everything from the herbal bundles hanging from the rafters to the worn books stacked beside her bed. "Why do you live all alone up here?" he asked, as he watched her mend one of Marcus's old shirts for Thomas to wear. "Aren't you scared?" Abigail's fingers continued their steady rhythm with the needle. "What would I be scared of?" William's eyes widened. "Bears, wolves, bad people." A faint smile touched Abigail's lips. "Bears are asleep in winter. Wolves prefer deer to tough old women. And bad people rarely make the climb up here, especially in snow." "But don't you get lonely?" The question, delivered with a child's innocent directness, made Abigail's hands still for just a moment. Did she get lonely? Of course she did. But loneliness had become such a constant companion that she hardly noticed it anymore, like the chronic ache in her knees or the sound of wind through the pines. "I have my books," she said finally, "and the forest creatures, and memories." She tied off the thread and bit it cleanly with her teeth. "That's plenty for an old woman." William frowned, clearly unsatisfied with her answer, but was distracted when Grace finally woke, calling for him in a small, frightened voice. The little girl had been mostly silent since their arrival, speaking only in whispers to her brothers. Her huge blue eyes followed Abigail, with a mixture of wariness and fascination. As William went to comfort his sister, Thomas approached Abigail with a determined set to his jaw. "We need to earn our keep," he said. "There must be work we can do." Abigail regarded him steadily. "You can barely stand without trembling. Your body needs to recover." "I'm stronger than I look." The stubborn lift of his chin reminded Abigail painfully of her own son, gone nearly 30 years now, taken by the same consumption that would later claim Marcus. "Just tell me what needs doing." Recognizing the pride beneath the offer, Abigail nodded. The woodpile could use stacking, but only for as long as your strength holds. The mountains have already taken enough from you children. Throughout the afternoon, Abigail found small tasks for each of them, tasks that contributed to their survival while allowing their bodies to mend. Thomas stacked wood under the cabin's overhang, protected from the falling snow. William sorted dried beans, removing any stones or damaged ones. Even little Grace was given a job, unraveling an old sweater so the yarn could be reused. By the time dusk draped the mountains in deepening purple, the children were exhausted but somehow more settled, as if having a purpose, however small, had helped anchor them in this strange new reality. They gathered around the table for a dinner of bean soup, thinner than Abigail would normally have made it, stretched to feed 4 instead of 1. No one complained. Even Grace managed to finish her small bowl, though she still wouldn't speak directly to Abigail. As Abigail washed the bowls, Thomas helped William and Grace prepare for bed. She could hear him speaking softly to them, reassuring, words that broke occasionally with suppressed emotion. He was trying so hard to be strong, this boy who had just lost his father, this child forced too soon into a man's responsibilities. When the younger ones were settled, Thomas returned to the table where Abigail now sat with one of her precious candles, darning a sock by its meager light. "You saved our lives," he said abruptly. "I don't think I properly thanked you." Abigail continued her darning, the familiar motion soothing. "No thanks needed." "But there is," Thomas insisted. "You didn't have to come looking. You didn't have to take us in. And what kind of person would I be if I'd let 3 children freeze to death on my doorstep?" Abigail looked up, her gaze direct. "This world has enough cruelty in it without my adding to it." Thomas was silent for a moment, his young face solemn in the candlelight. "Our mother used to say that," he said finally, "that the world was cruel. Enough without people making it worse. Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." His voice faltered. "Father was never the same after she died. He talked less, smiled less. That's why we were moving to Pine Ridge. He said we needed a fresh start away from the memories." Abigail understood this all too well. After Marcus died, she'd briefly considered leaving the cabin, returning to the town where at least other humans existed. But in the end, she'd chosen to stay with her ghosts rather than face the living who had never understood her. "Memories follow you," she said softly, "no matter where you go." Thomas nodded, a child comprehending an adult truth too early. "The day before we left, Father took us to Mother's grave to say goodbye. He promised her we'd be all right." His voice broke. "I should have been watching the road better. I should have warned him about the ice." The raw guilt in his voice cut through Abigail's careful reserve. Without thinking, she reached across the table and covered his hand with her own, the first deliberate touch she had offered any of them. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "The mountain roads are treacherous even for those who know them well. Your father made his choice to travel in winter. What happened was a tragedy, but it was not your fault, not one bit of it." Tears welled in Thomas's eyes, but he blinked them back defiantly. "I have to take care of them now, William and Grace. I promised Father I would." "And you will," Abigail said. "But right now, you need to rest, to heal. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles without borrowing from today." After Thomas had joined his siblings by the fire, Abigail sat alone at the table, the candle burning lower. The boy's grief had stirred something in her, breaking through layers of careful isolation she had built around herself. These children, orphaned and vulnerable, awoke protective instincts she had thought long dead, but protection required resources, and those were dwindling faster than she cared to admit. The reality of their situation remained stark. 4 people, limited supplies, and weeks of winter isolation ahead. Outside, the wind picked up again, keening around the corners of the cabin. Another storm approaching, or just the regular mountain night winds? Abigail couldn't be sure, but as she prepared for bed, checking the fire one last time, she found herself offering a silent prayer, something she hadn't done since Marcus's death. Not for herself, but for 3 small souls delivered to her doorstep by a storm that should have killed them. Dawn broke clear and bitingly cold. Abigail woke to find frost patterns etched across the inside of the windows and her breath visible in the chill air. The fire had burned down overnight, the cabin's temperature dropping dangerously low. Moving quietly to avoid waking the children, she rekindled the flames, feeding the fire with smaller sticks until it caught properly. As warmth gradually returned to the room, she found herself studying the sleeping children with a mixture of concern and something dangerously close to tenderness. They had instinctively huddled together during the night, forming a protective knot of limbs and shared warmth. Even in sleep, Thomas kept one arm around Grace, his body positioned between his siblings and the door. William had wrapped himself around his little sister from the other side, his face pressed against her hair. They would survive this, Abigail decided. Somehow, they would all survive. By the time the children stirred, Abigail had melted snow for washing and prepared a breakfast of cornmeal cakes, each one thinner than she would normally make. But there were 4 mouths to feed now. The smell of the cooking food finally roused them, William waking first with an enthusiastic sniff. "That smells wonderful," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. He nudged Thomas, who woke instantly, alert as always. As they ate, Abigail shared her plans for the day. "The storm has passed for now. We need to take advantage of the clear weather." Thomas looked up sharply. "To find the wagon?" "That, yes, but also to check my traps. If we're lucky, there might be a rabbit or 2. "You set traps?" William asked, clearly impressed. "How else would I get meat in winter?" Abigail replied. "The general store doesn't exactly deliver up here." This elicited a small giggle from William, and even Thomas's serious expression lightened momentarily. Only Grace remained solemn, her blue eyes watchful as she methodically broke her cornmeal cake into tiny pieces before eating them. "I'll come with you," Thomas said. "To check the traps and look for the wagon." Abigail assessed him. The boy was still pale, with shadows under his eyes, but there was color in his cheeks now. His hands no longer trembled when he held his spoon. It wasn't ideal, but they needed the supplies from that wagon if they were to survive the winter. "Very well," she said, "but William and Grace will stay here where it's warm." William immediately protested. "But I want to come too. I'm strong enough." "You are," Abigail agreed, "but someone needs to look after your sister and keep the fire going. That's an important job." This explanation seemed to satisfy him, especially when Abigail added that she would show him how to tend the fire properly, a responsibility that made his chest puff out with pride. As Abigail and Thomas prepared to venture out, bundling up in layers of wool and leather, Grace suddenly spoke, the first words she had directly addressed to Abigail. "Will you come back?" Her voice was tiny but clear, a silver bell in the quiet cabin. Abigail knelt before the little girl, meeting those solemn blue eyes. "Yes," she said firmly, "we will come back. I promise." Grace studied her face for a long moment, then gave a single nod, apparently satisfied with whatever she found there. Outside, the world had been transformed into a crystalline wonderland. The snow lay deep and undisturbed, reflecting the morning sunlight with blinding brilliance. The pines stood, encased in ice, their branches hanging heavy and glittering. The air was so cold it burned the lungs with each breath. Thomas gasped at the beauty of it, momentarily distracted from his worries. "It's like a fairy story," he murmured. "A treacherous fairy story," Abigail warned, securing a rope around both their waists. "Stay close. In these conditions, you could lose sight of me in seconds if the wind picks up." They moved carefully through the snow, Abigail leading the way to her nearest traplines. The drifts came to Thomas's thighs in places, and Abigail found herself constantly checking to ensure he wasn't overexerting himself. But the boy showed remarkable stamina, his jaw set with determination as he followed in her tracks. The first 2 traps were empty, but the third held a snowshoe hare, its white fur now stained with blood. Thomas turned away as Abigail efficiently removed the animal and reset the trap. "I've never seen an animal killed before," he admitted, his voice small. "Father bought our meat from the butcher." "It's not an easy thing to get used to," Abigail said, wrapping the hare in a piece of cloth and placing it in her pack. "But it's necessary up here. The animal gave its life so we might continue ours. There's no shame in that exchange, but there should always be respect." Thomas nodded solemnly, "like a sacred agreement." Something like that. Abigail was struck again by the boy's old soul, his capacity to grasp concepts that many adults struggled with. They checked 3 more traps, finding 1 more hare and a grouse that had sought the bait in desperation. It wasn't a bountiful haul, but it would provide meat for at least 2 meals, stretched carefully with vegetables and grain. As they turned back toward the cabin, Thomas suddenly froze, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line. "What is it?" Abigail asked, instantly alert. "I think—" He squinted against the sun's glare on snow. "I think I recognize that outcropping, the rock that looks like a sleeping bear. We passed it after the wagon fell." Abigail followed his gaze. Indeed, there was a formation of rock that resembled a bear in repose, its distinctive shape visible even under a blanket of snow. "You're sure?" she pressed. Thomas nodded, more confidently now. "Yes. We climbed up past it. The ravine should be just beyond to the east." They changed course, moving carefully toward the outcropping. The going was slower here, the snow deeper where it had drifted against the base of the rocks. As they rounded the formation, Thomas suddenly gripped Abigail's arm. "There," he whispered, pointing down a steep incline. "That's where we climbed up." Abigail peered cautiously over the edge. The ravine was about 30 feet deep, its bottom obscured by snow and the twisted remains of pine trees that had been carried down in previous avalanches. And there, just visible through the tangle of broken branches, was the splintered wheel of a wagon. Thomas's breath caught. "That's it," he said, his voice tight. "That's our wagon." They stood silently for a moment, both aware of who else must lie at the bottom of that ravine. Abigail placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, feeling the slight tremor that ran through him. "We don't have to do this now," she said gently. "We can come back another day." But Thomas straightened his shoulders, a child forcing himself to be a man. "No," he said. "We need the supplies. And I need to know for certain." Abigail nodded, understanding both the spoken and unspoken parts of his statement. He needed closure, needed to see with his own eyes what had happened to his father. "Stay here," she instructed. "I'll go down alone first to check if it's safe." "But no arguments, Thomas. 1 person at risk is better than 2. Her tone brooked no opposition. "If something happens to me, you follow the rope back to the cabin. William and Grace will need you." Before he could protest further, Abigail secured her end of the rope to a sturdy pine and began the treacherous descent into the ravine. The slope was steep but navigable, with enough exposed rock and tree roots to provide handholds. Still, she moved with extreme caution, testing each step before committing her weight. When she reached the bottom, she found herself standing in snow that reached above her knees. The wagon lay on its side, partially buried in snow and broken timber. 1 wheel jutted skyward like an accusation, while another had splintered completely on impact. The canvas covering had torn away, exposing the family's possessions to the elements, and there, half buried in snow beside the wagon, lay the still form of a man. Abigail approached slowly, respectfully. Even without touching him, she knew he was dead. No one could survive a night in these temperatures, especially not after such a fall. His face was peaceful in death, the snow having softened the harsher realities of his end. He had been handsome. Once she could see that, the same dark eyes as Thomas, now closed forever, a strong jaw, dark hair frosted with premature grey. He looked to be in his late 30s, too young to leave 3 children orphaned in this harsh world. "I found them," she said quietly to the still form. "They're safe. I'll keep them that way until spring, I promise you that." She remained beside him for a moment longer. This stranger who had entrusted his most precious possessions, his children, to her care through the vagaries of fate and weather. Then, with a practiced efficiency born of mountain living, she turned her attention to the wagon and its contents. Much had been damaged in the fall, or ruined by exposure to the elements. But there were treasures too. A sack of flour, miraculously intact, jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, a crate of candles, a box containing sewing supplies, another with fishing tackle and hunting ammunition, and wrapped carefully in oilcloth at the bottom of a trunk, a fiddle, old but well-maintained, its surface polished by years of loving use. Abigail stared at the instrument, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold seeping through her. William's words echoed in her mind. "We heard your fiddle through the trees." But her fiddle had been hanging untouched on the cabin wall. This one had been at the bottom of a ravine, silenced by its owner's death. What music had guided those children? To her door, she had no answer. Perhaps there was none to be found in this world of flesh and bone and bitter cold. Some mysteries, like some griefs, could only be carried, not solved. Carefully, she gathered what supplies she could carry, securing them in her pack. The rest would have to wait for another trip, with a sled to transport the larger items. The fiddle she wrapped again in its protective cloth and tucked securely under her arm. "Thomas," she called up, "I'm coming back now." The boy's face appeared at the edge of the ravine, anxious and pale. "Did you find—" "Yes," she said simply. "Your father is at peace, and I found supplies that will help us through the winter." As she climbed back up the treacherous slope, Abigail felt the weight of the fiddle against her side, a tangible reminder of promises made, both to a dead man she had never met and to 3 living children who now depended on her for survival. The mountain had taken, as it always did, but perhaps, in its harsh way, it had also given something in return. 3 days passed in a fragile rhythm of survival. With each sunrise, Abigail found herself adjusting to the presence of the children, their voices, their needs, their small bodies occupying spaces in her cabin that had known only emptiness for years. It wasn't easy. Decades of solitude had calcified her habits, made her unaccustomed to explaining her actions or considering the feelings of others. And yet, she found herself doing both with increasing frequency. The discovery of the wagon had provided them with crucial supplies. Abigail and Thomas had made 2 more trips to the ravine, hauling back everything salvageable on a makeshift sled. Food, clothing, tools, household goods, the modest possessions of a family starting over had become their lifeline. They had also, with solemn care, covered Thomas's father with stones and branches to protect his body from scavengers until a proper burial could be arranged in spring. Thomas had stood rigid during this improvised ceremony, his young face a mask of control that occasionally slipped to reveal the raw grief beneath. William had wept openly, while Grace, too young to fully comprehend death's permanence, had asked repeatedly when father would wake up. Now, as Abigail stirred a pot of stew made hearty with preserved vegetables from the wagon, she watched the children engaged in their evening tasks. Thomas sat at the table, meticulously cleaning the rifle they had recovered, his father's Winchester, which Abigail had agreed he should learn to use. William arranged kindling near the fireplace, his small hands working with surprising dexterity. And Grace, seated on a stool by the window, carefully polished her father's fiddle with a soft cloth, her tiny face intent with concentration. The fiddle had become an unexpected source of comfort. Abigail had initially hesitated to give it to the children, unsettled by the mystery of the music that had supposedly guided them through the storm. But Grace had spotted it among the retrieved possessions and had reached for it with such yearning that Abigail couldn't refuse her. "Father played every night," Thomas had explained. "Even after Mother died, he said music speaks when words fail." Now the instrument sat in Grace's lap, too large for her to play, but perfect for her to cradle like a doll. She hummed tunelessly. As she worked, a fragment of melody that sometimes caught at the edges of Abigail's memory. A sudden gust rattled the windows, drawing Abigail's attention to the weather outside. The sky had been clear that morning, but clouds had gathered by midday, heavy with promise of more snow. The mountains were never generous with fair weather in February. "Storm's coming," she said, more to herself than to the children. "A big one by the feel of it." Thomas looked up from the rifle. "How can you tell?" "The air pressure changed. Makes my joints ache." Abigail flexed her fingers, feeling the familiar stiffness. "And the birds were quiet this morning. They know better than any weatherman when trouble's brewing." "Will it be as bad as the one that found us?" William asked, a note of fear threading through his voice. Abigail considered how to answer. The children had been through enough trauma without her adding to their fears, yet she had never believed in coddling, not even when her own son was alive. Truth was better than comfort in her experience. "At least truth prepared you." "Hard to say," she replied. "The February storms can be brutal, but we have shelter, food, and firewood. We're better prepared than most." This seemed to reassure William, who returned to his kindling with renewed purpose. Thomas, however, studied her face with that unsettling perception of his. "We should bring in more wood before it starts," he said, "and check the shutters." Abigail nodded, approving of his practical response to danger. "We'll do that after supper." As they ate, gathered around the small table that had never known so many occupants, Abigail found herself observing the subtle dynamics between the siblings. Thomas, clearly accustomed to responsibility even before his father's death, made sure William and Grace ate their fill before finishing his own portion. William, bright and curious, peppered Abigail with questions about mountain life, each answer seeming to spawn 3 new inquiries. And Grace, still largely silent except with her brothers, watched Abigail with those solemn blue eyes that seemed to see more than a child of 5 should. "Where did you learn to trap?" William asked, reaching for a second piece of cornbread. "Did your father teach you, like Thomas's father taught him to fish?" "My husband taught me," Abigail replied, surprised to find the words didn't stick in her throat as they once might have. Marcus knew everything about mountain living, how to read weather, track game, preserve food for winter. "You had a husband." And William's eyes widened, as if he couldn't imagine Abigail as anything but the solitary figure they had encountered. "Of course she did," Thomas said with the exasperated tone of an older sibling. "She's wearing a wedding band." He gestured to the simple gold ring on Abigail's gnarled finger. Abigail touched the ring absently. She rarely thought about it anymore. It had become as much a part of her as her own skin. "Yes, I had a husband, and a son." This disclosure seemed to surprise even Thomas. "You have a son. Where is he?" had Abigail corrected gently. "He died when he was about your age, Thomas. The consumption took him, and then, many years later, it took Marcus too." A silence fell over the table, heavy with the shared understanding of loss. Even Grace looked up from her plate, her eyes meeting. Abigail's in a moment of perfect comprehension that transcended age. "I'm sorry," Thomas said finally, his voice low. "About your son and your husband." Abigail nodded, accepting his condolences with the same quiet dignity with which he had accepted hers days earlier. It was a long time ago. Is that why you live alone? William asked. Because they died? William, Thomas warned, shooting his brother a look. That's not polite to ask. But Abigail didn't mind the question. Children had a directness that most adults lost, a willingness to probe the wounded places that others carefully avoided. Partly, she said. After they were gone, there didn't seem much point in being around other people. The mountain made more sense to me. It's honest, at least. It doesn't pretend to be kind when it isn't. Like the people in town, Thomas said, with sudden understanding. They pretend to be nice, but they whisper when they think you can't hear. Abigail looked at him sharply. You've experienced that. Thomas nodded, pushing his stew around his plate. After Mother died, people brought food and said nice things to our faces. But I heard them talking when they thought I wasn't listening. They said Father couldn't manage without her, that we'd be better off sent to an orphanage. The familiar anger rose in Abigail's chest, anger at the casual cruelty of so-called civilized folks. People fear what they don't understand, she said. Grief makes them uncomfortable. They'd rather tidy it away where they don't have to look at it. Is that why they don't like you? William asked. Because you're sad about your family? William! Thomas looked mortified, but Abigail actually chuckled, a rusty sound that surprised even her. Partly, but mostly because I didn't act the way a widow is supposed to act. I didn't remarry. I didn't sell this place and move into town like a sensible woman. I stayed up here and learned to live without depending on anyone. I think that's brave, William declared. Like a hero in a storybook. It's not brave, Abigail corrected, though she was oddly touched by his assessment. It's just living on your own terms. That frightens some people more than bears or blizzards ever could. After supper, Thomas helped Abigail secure the cabin against the coming storm. They checked the shutters, brought in extra firewood, and made sure the drainage channels around the cabin's perimeter were clear of ice to prevent flooding when the snow eventually melted. As they worked, a new kind of silence grew between them. Not the wary quiet of strangers, but the comfortable silence of people engaged in shared purpose. Abigail found herself impressed by the boy's methodical approach, his attention to details that many adults would overlook. Your father taught you well, she observed as Thomas expertly stacked the firewood to maximize drying while minimizing space. A shadow crossed his face at the mention of his father, but he nodded. He said a man should know how to take care of his family. He was right about that, but it's not just men who need those skills. Thomas considered this, then nodded again. You take care of yourself, and now us. For the time being, Abigail agreed, but come spring, when the road's clear, you'll go to your aunt in Pine Ridge. She had meant it as reassurance, a reminder that their displacement was temporary, that a more conventional home awaited them. But Thomas's face fell slightly, and she realized he had begun to think of the cabin as a kind of sanctuary. Do you think, he began, then stopped himself. Never mind. Speak your mind, boy. I'm too old for guessing games. Thomas hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. Do you think our aunt will still want us? Without father, we'll be another burden. 3 more mouths to feed. The question struck Abigail with unexpected force. She had assumed the children's aunt would welcome them, assumed there was a place waiting when the winter isolation ended. But of course, life was rarely so accommodating. An aunt who had agreed to house a brother and his children might feel very differently about 3 orphans appearing on her doorstep. Your aunt is family, she said finally. Family takes care of its own. But even as she spoke the words, Abigail knew they rang hollow. Hadn't her own sister turned her back when Marcus died? Hadn't her brother-in-law suggested selling the cabin as if the home she had made with her husband was just another asset to be liquidated? Thomas seemed to sense her uncertainty. It's all right, he said with that unnerving maturity. We'll manage. I'm old enough to work. William, too, soon enough. The matter-of-fact way he discussed his own potential exploitation sent a surge of protectiveness through Abigail. "You're children," she said firmly, "not work horses. There's time enough for labor when you've had a chance to be young." Thomas looked at her strangely, as if such a concept had never occurred to him. Before he could respond, William burst through the cabin door, his face alight with excitement. "It's snowing again," he announced. "Big fluffy flakes like goose feathers." Indeed, when Abigail and Thomas followed him outside, they found the world being transformed once more. The snow fell in silent abundance, thick flakes spiraling down from a sky the color of slate. The wind had died completely, creating an unnatural stillness in which each snowflake's descent seemed individually choreographed. Grace had followed them onto the porch, her small hand slipping into Thomas's. Her eyes widened at the sight of the snow, not with fear as Abigail might have expected, but with wonder. "Pretty," she whispered, reaching out to catch a flake on her mitten. They stood together, these four souls thrown together by tragedy and chance, and watched as the mountains enacted their ancient implacable will upon the world. The falling snow quickly covered the scars of their recent labors, the path to the woodpile, the tracks to and from the ravine, the area around the cabin they had cleared. Nature's erasure was relentless and complete. "We should get inside," Abigail said eventually, noting how the snow was beginning to fall more heavily. "This is just the beginning." By nightfall, the storm had announced itself in earnest. Wind howled around the cabin corners, finding every crack and crevice, while snow accumulated with alarming speed. The temperature plummeted, forcing Abigail to keep the fire burning hotter than she would normally allow, consuming their firewood at a concerning rate. The children huddled near the hearth, William and Grace eventually falling asleep despite the storm's fury. Thomas remained awake, his back against the wall, knees drawn to his chest as he stared into the flames. Abigail sat in her rocking chair, mending one of William's shirts by the light of a candle. The familiar rhythm of needle and thread usually calmed her, but tonight her thoughts were as turbulent as the weather outside. "You should sleep," she told Thomas. "The storm may last days. Best to rest while you can." He shook his head. "I keep thinking about Father. Out there in the cold." Abigail's hands stilled. "He doesn't feel the cold anymore, Thomas." "I know." His voice was barely audible over the wind. "But I do." Setting aside her mending, Abigail moved to sit beside him on the floor, her joints protesting. The unaccustomed position. "Grief is like frostbite," she said quietly. "At first it just numbs you. You think maybe it's not so bad. But then the thawing starts, and that's when the real pain begins." Thomas looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Does it ever stop hurting?" "No," Abigail said honestly. "But you learn to live with it. The pain becomes part of you, like an old injury that aches when the weather changes." They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames dance. Outside, the storm intensified, snow piling against the windows until the glass was completely obscured. "I've been thinking," Thomas said finally, "about what you said earlier, about family taking care of its own." Abigail waited, sensing he needed to find his own way to whatever conclusion he was approaching. "Our aunt, she's not really our aunt. She was Mother's friend, not a blood relation. Father called her aunt because it was simpler for us children." He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "She was kind when Mother died, but she has her own family, her own children." The revelation settled between them, its implications clear. These children had even less certainty in their future than Abigail had assumed. "I see," she said. "I don't want to be a burden," Thomas continued, the words coming faster now, "to our aunt or to you. But I need to keep William and Grace safe. I promised Father." Abigail studied him. This child carrying a man's responsibilities, determined to honor His word, even as the world dissolved around him. In him, she recognized the same fierce loyalty that had kept her on this mountain after everyone she loved was gone. "You're not a burden," she said firmly. "None of you are. And when spring comes, we'll figure out what happens next. Together." Thomas looked up, surprise and cautious hope dawning in his eyes. "You mean that? Even though we came to you by accident?" Abigail snorted softly. "Boy, I'm not sure I believe in accidents anymore. Not after you followed fiddle music through a blizzard to the only cabin for miles around. The unexplained music hung between them, a mystery neither could solve. But in that moment, it didn't seem to matter whether the music had been real or imagined, a desperate hallucination or something more inexplicable. What mattered was that it had brought them together, four broken pieces that somehow formed a makeshift whole. "Try to sleep," Abigail said, rising stiffly to her feet. "Tomorrow will be soon enough to worry about the future." As Thomas finally settled beside his siblings, Abigail returned to her chair by the fire. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace had taken root. Not the empty quiet of her solitary existence, but something warmer, something she had not felt in decades. The feeling followed her into uneasy dreams. Dreams of Marcus playing a fiddle she didn't recognize, of her son running through snow without leaving footprints, of three small figures guided by music only they could hear. She woke before dawn to absolute silence. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake a stillness so profound it seemed almost holy. The fire had burned low, the cabin cool but not cold. The children slept on, exhausted by days of emotional and physical exertion. Moving quietly, Abigail built up the fire, then went to the window. The snow had piled nearly to the bottom of the glass, transforming the world outside into a featureless white expanse. They would be truly isolated now, perhaps for weeks. The thought, which once would have brought comfort, now carried a sharper edge of concern. 4 people meant 4 times the consumption of resources, 4 times the possibility of illness or accident. But as she watched the first pink light of dawn touch the snow-laden pines, Abigail found herself embracing the challenge rather than dreading it. These children needed her, not just her cabin or her supplies, but her knowledge, her strength. For the first time in years, she was necessary to someone. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it filled a hollow space she had carried. So long she'd forgotten it existed. A soft sound behind her made her turn. Grace stood in her too large nightgown, her blonde hair tousled from sleep, her father's fiddle clutched in her small arms. "Good morning," Abigail said quietly, not wanting to wake the boys. Grace didn't reply, but she padded across the floor on bare feet and held out the fiddle. Her expression was solemn, expectant. "What is it?" Abigail asked, kneeling with difficulty, to the child's level. "Do you want me to put it away for you?" Grace shook her head and pushed the instrument more insistently toward Abigail. "You want me to play?" Abigail's brow furrowed. "I don't know how, child. That was your father's skill, not mine." Grace's blue eyes remained fixed on Abigail's face, patient but determined. Slowly, she turned the fiddle in her hands and pointed to something carved into the wood near the base of the neck. Abigail peered closer. 2 initials were etched there, the letters worn smooth with age, M.T. Marcus Thornwood. Abigail's heart seemed to stop, then resume at double speed. Her hands trembled as she took the instrument from Grace, turning it to examine every inch of its surface. There was no mistake. This was Marcus's fiddle, the one he had played on summer evenings on their porch, the one he had taught their son. The beginnings of before illness took him, the fiddle she had buried with her husband because she couldn't bear to hear it played by anyone else. Yet here it was, somehow retrieved from a grave on one mountain and carried to another, into the possession of a man she had never met, and then back to her through the hands of his orphaned daughter. "Where?" Abigail's voice failed her. "How did your father get this?" Grace merely watched her, offering no explanation. Perhaps she had none to give. With unsteady fingers, Abigail raised the fiddle to her chin, positioning it as she had seen Marcus do 1,000 times. She had never played, had never had the patience to learn. But as she drew the bow across the strings, a single clear note emerged, pure as mountain air. The sound seemed to ripple through the cabin, stirring dust motes in the early light. Grace nodded solemnly, as if Abigail had confirmed something important. "Music speaks when words fail," the child whispered, echoing what Thomas had said their father believed. Before Abigail could respond, a new sound intruded, the distant but unmistakable jingle of harness bells. Someone was coming up the mountain trail. She set the fiddle aside and moved swiftly to the window, wiping frost from the glass to peer outside. In the pristine white landscape, a line of dark shapes was moving toward the cabin. Riders on horseback, at least a dozen, making steady progress through snow that should have been impassable. "Thomas," she called, her voice sharper than intended. "Wake up, we have visitors." The boy was instantly alert, reaching for the Winchester before he was fully upright. William stirred more slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Who is it?" Thomas asked, joining her at the window. "The town?" Abigail shook her head. "I don't recognize them." A cold weight settled in her stomach. No one from town would attempt the mountain in these conditions, no one with good intentions, at least. As the riders drew closer, details became clearer. Men mostly bundled against the cold, their breath and their horses forming clouds in the frigid air. They rode in formation, purposeful rather than casual, and at the front, leading them toward her cabin, was a figure slightly smaller than the rest, riding a horse as black as midnight. "Get away from the windows," Abigail instructed, her mind racing. "Thomas, check that the rifle is loaded. William, Grace, stay by the fire." "Are they dangerous?" William asked, his voice small with renewed fear. Abigail didn't answer immediately. The mountains had taught her caution, taught her that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. But as she watched the approaching riders, something tugged at her memory. Something about the way the lead rider sat in the saddle, straight-backed and assured. Grace appeared at her side, her small face pressed to the glass. She studied the oncoming procession for a long moment. Then, to Abigail's astonishment, she smiled, the first real smile Abigail had seen from the child. "It's all right," Grace said with absolute certainty. "They're coming to help." Abigail looked from the child to the approaching riders and back again. "How do you know that?" But Grace had already turned away, moving to retrieve her father's fiddle. Marcus's fiddle. From where Abigail had left it, outside, the riders drew up before the cabin. The leader dismounted with fluid grace, removing her hat to reveal a face lined by weather and time, but still striking. Silver hair was pulled back in a severe braid, and eyes the color of storm clouds surveyed the cabin with knowing assessment. Abigail's. A breath caught. She knew that face, older now, changed by the years, but unmistakable nonetheless. "Maggie," she whispered, the name foreign on her tongue after so many years. Margaret Blackwood, her sister, the one who had turned away when Marcus died, the one who had told Abigail that grief had made her a stranger. And now, impossibly, she stood outside Abigail's door with a dozen riders at her back, having crossed miles of snow-choked mountain trails that should have been impassable. "Children," Abigail said, her voice steadier than she felt, "it seems we have family visiting." For a moment that stretched like taffy, Abigail stood frozen at the threshold of her cabin, one hand braced against the doorframe. The sight of her sister after nearly 20 years struck her with physical force. Margaret had aged, certainly. The sleek black hair, now silver, the proud face mapped with lines of experience, but she carried herself with the same unbending dignity Abigail remembered. "Hello, Abby," Margaret said, using the childhood nickname that no one had spoken aloud since before Marcus died. "Maggie," Abigail replied, her voice rusty with disuse. "You're about the last person I expected to see riding up my mountain." Margaret's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Not just me." She gestured to the riders behind her. Men and women still mounted, their faces obscured by scarves and hats pulled low against the cold. "So I see." Abigail made no move to invite them in. "What brings the great Margaret Blackwood to my humble doorstep after all this time? Last I recall, you said I'd buried myself up here with the ghosts, and you were finished trying to dig me out." A flicker of something, regret, pain, crossed Margaret's face. "That was a long time ago, Abby. We were both hurting." "Some hurts don't heal," Abigail replied, thinking not just of Marcus and her son, but of the sister who had abandoned her to her grief. "Why are you here, Maggie?" Before Margaret could answer, movement stirred behind Abigail. Thomas appeared. At her side, his young face set in wary lines, the Winchester held not quite pointing at the visitors, but not quite relaxed either. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Thornwood?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. Abigail placed a gentle hand on his arm, guiding the rifle toward the floor. "Yes, Thomas. This is my sister, Margaret." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, but he maintained his protective stance. "You never mentioned a sister." "No," Abigail agreed. "I didn't." Margaret studied the boy with undisguised interest. "I see you found yourself some company after all these years of solitude, Abby." "They found me," Abigail corrected. "Lost in the blizzard a week ago. Their father's wagon went over the edge of Deadman's Ravine." Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes. "The Colton children," she said. "We've been searching for them for days." Now, it was Abigail's turn to be surprised. "You know these children?" "Not personally," Margaret replied, "but Joshua Colton was bringing them to Pine Ridge, to Eliza Miller's boarding house. When they didn't arrive as scheduled, Eliza sent word to the county sheriff. With the storms, no one could mount a proper search until now." Abigail felt Thomas stiffen beside her. "How do you know Aunt Eliza?" he demanded. Margaret's gaze softened as she addressed the boy directly. "I own half the businesses in Pine Ridge, young man, including the building where Eliza runs her boarding house. She came to me when she realized you were missing. So you rode through a blizzard to find them?" Abigail couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. The sister she remembered had never been one for selfless rescue missions. "Not just me." Margaret gestured again to her companions. "These are men and women from Pine Ridge and the surrounding homesteads. When word spread that children were missing in the mountains, they volunteered. As if on cue, the riders began to dismount. They were a hardy-looking bunch, dressed in practical layers of wool and leather, their faces weathered from outdoor living. They nodded respectfully to Abigail, but maintained a slight distance, sensing the tension between the sisters. William and Grace had crept forward to peer around Abigail and Thomas. At the sight of so many strangers, Grace instinctively reached for Thomas's hand, while William stared with undisguised curiosity. "Are those real cowboys?" he whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the group. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered with a salt and pepper beard, touched the brim of his hat. "Some of us, young sir, though these days we spend more time fixing fences than wrangling cattle." Margaret turned back to Abigail. "May we come in? It's been a long, cold ride, and we have much to discuss." Abigail hesitated. Her cabin, which had seemed overcrowded with just 4 occupants, could never accommodate a dozen more. Moreover, the thought of her private sanctuary being invaded by strangers, and by the sister who had once judged her choices so harshly, made her chest tighten with anxiety. Thomas seemed to sense her distress. "We can make coffee," he suggested, quietly, And there's still some stew from yesterday, not enough for everyone, but his willingness to share their precious resources with these strangers touched Abigail. It was the kind of generosity she herself had once possessed, before years of isolation had narrowed her focus to mere survival. "The cabin's too small for all," she said finally. "But your men can set up in the storage shed. It's not fancy, but it's sheltered. You and 2 others can come inside, Maggie." Margaret nodded, apparently recognizing this as the significant concession it was. She turned and gave quiet instructions to her companions, who began unloading supplies and leading horses toward the shed Abigail had indicated. Margaret selected 2 to accompany her, the bearded man who had spoken to William and a compact, serious-looking woman with shrewd eyes and a medical bag slung over her shoulder. "Dr. Elaine Chen," Margaret introduced the woman, "and Samuel Green, who owns the lumber mill in Pine Ridge." Abigail stepped back, allowing them entry into her home. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the ceiling lower, with these adult strangers filling the space. The children clustered near the fireplace, Grace still clutching her father's fiddle, while Thomas maintained his position slightly in front of his siblings. An awkward silence descended, broken only when William blurted, "Did you really come all this way just to find us?" Dr. Chen smiled, her stern face softening. "We did indeed. Your Aunt Eliza has been beside herself with worry." "She's not really our aunt," Thomas said, a defensive edge to his voice. "Just Mother's friend." "Be that as it may," Samuel interjected gently, "she cares for you children a great deal, enough to rally half the county to search when your wagon never arrived." "How did you find us?" Abigail asked, the practical question foremost in her mind. "This cabin isn't on any maps, and the snow would have covered any tracks from the ravine." Margaret and her companions exchanged glances that Abigail couldn't quite interpret. Finally, Margaret spoke. "That's part of what we need to discuss, Abby. We didn't find you by chance." "What does that mean?" Thomas demanded, his protective instincts flaring again. Instead of answering directly, Margaret turned to Grace. "You've been holding that fiddle since we arrived, little one. May I see it?" Grace clutched the instrument tighter for a moment, then, after looking to Abigail for confirmation, reluctantly handed it to Margaret. The silver-haired woman examined it carefully, her fingers tracing. The worn surface, the polished neck, the initials carved near the base MT. "Marcus Thornwood," she said softly. "My brother-in-law." Abigail felt the room tilt slightly. "That fiddle was buried with him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 20 years ago in the churchyard in Cold Springs. So I'll ask you, one more time, Maggie, how did you find us?" Margaret handed the fiddle back to Grace, who cradled it protectively. 3 nights ago, half the county heard fiddle music coming from the mountains," she said. "Not just any music, Marcus's music, that reel he composed the summer before your son took ill." "Impossible," Abigail breathed, though the chill racing down her spine suggested otherwise. "I thought so too," Margaret agreed. "But I wasn't the only one who heard it. Samuel did, Dr. Chen, dozens of others. It played for hours through the worst of the blizzard, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of your cabin." "We heard it too," William piped up. "That's how we found the cabin. Thomas said it was just the wind, but I knew it was music." Samuel nodded, his expression solemn. "That music guided us here just as surely as any map. We followed it through passes that should have been impassable, through snowdrifts that parted like magic before our horses." Abigail looked to Dr. Chen, hoping the physician might offer a more rational explanation, but the doctor merely shrugged. "I'm a woman of science, Mrs. Thornwood, but I know what I heard. That fiddle called us here, to you and these children." The implications hung in the air, too fantastical to be spoken aloud, but too powerful to be dismissed. Somehow, Marcus's fiddle, an instrument that should have been decaying in a grave 100 miles away, had found its way to these children, had guided them through a blizzard to Abigail's door, and then had summoned help from Pine Ridge when they needed it most. Why? Abigail asked, the single word encompassing all her confusion, her disbelief, her fragile hope. Margaret stepped closer, close enough that Abigail could see the fine lines around her eyes, the strand of silver hair that had escaped her braid. "I think," she said gently, "that someone wanted these children found, and someone wanted you found too, Abby, after all these years alone." Abigail turned away, unwilling to let her sister see the emotion rising in her throat. She busied herself at the stove, pouring coffee into mismatched cups with hands that trembled slightly. The rational part of her mind insisted there must be a logical explanation. Coincidences, confusion in the storm, the tricks memory plays after years of grief. And yet, hadn't she felt something shift the moment the children arrived? Hadn't she recognized deep in her bones that their appearance was somehow meant? "These children need a home," Margaret continued, accepting the cup Abigail handed her. "Eliza Miller is willing, but her boarding house is already overcrowded, and she's not getting any younger." "What are you suggesting?" Abigail asked, though she already sensed the direction of her sister's thoughts. "They could stay with you," Margaret said simply. "Here in the cabin." Thomas's head snapped up, his dark eyes suddenly alight with cautious hope. William gasped softly, while Grace merely smiled, as if she had known this was coming all along. "That's absurd," Abigail protested, even as something warm unfurled in her chest. "I'm an old woman living on a remote mountain. These children need proper schooling, other children to play with, a community. Pine Ridge is only a half-day's ride in good weather," Samuel pointed out. "The boys could attend school in town during the fair months, stay with you during the winters. And I could teach Grace here until she's old enough for formal schooling." Margaret added, "I was a teacher before I married, if you recall." Abigail stared at her sister, momentarily speechless. "You're suggesting you'd visit regularly?" Margaret met her gaze steadily. "I'm suggesting I've wasted 20 years nursing old hurts, Abby. I'm suggesting that perhaps it's time both of us stopped living only with our ghosts." The proposal hung between them, as impossible and as tangible as the fiddle music that had guided strangers through a blizzard. Abigail looked at the children, Thomas standing straight-backed and serious, William practically vibrating with excitement at the idea, Grace serene with her father's fiddle. No, not her father's fiddle, Marcus's fiddle. An instrument that had somehow traveled from one grave to another, from one grieving family to another, creating a connection that defied rational explanation. "It wouldn't be easy," Abigail said slowly. "I'm set in my ways, and I know nothing about raising children." "You raised one before," Margaret reminded her softly. "And these children have already survived loss, Abby. They don't need perfection. They just need someone who won't give up on them." The words struck deep, piercing the armor Abigail had built around her heart over decades of self-imposed isolation. She thought of Thomas's determination to care for his siblings, of William's curiosity about her mountain life, of Grace's solemn trust when she'd handed over the fiddle. They had begun to matter to her, these orphan souls delivered to her doorstep by a storm. Perhaps they had begun to heal something in her that she had thought permanently broken. "What about you children?" she asked, turning to them. "This isn't a decision to be made without your say." Thomas glanced at his siblings, a silent communication passing between them. Then he squared his shoulders. "We'd like to stay," he said with simple dignity, "if you'll have us." "The mountains are exciting," William added enthusiastically, "and you know everything about them. You could teach us." Grace didn't speak, but she moved to Abigail's side and slipped her small hand into the older woman's calloused one. The touch, so simple and trusting, brought a lump to Abigail's throat. "It won't be easy," she warned again. "Life up here is hard, even in good weather." "We're stronger than we look," Thomas said, echoing his words from days earlier. "And we learn fast." Dr. Chen, who had been observing quietly, finally spoke. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Thornwood, I think these children could thrive here. They've shown remarkable resilience already, and having a purpose, a home, that's powerful medicine for grief." Abigail looked at Margaret, seeing in her sister's face not the judgment she had feared, but a cautious hope. "And you?" she asked. "You'd really ride up this mountain regularly to check on us, to teach grace?" "As often as weather permits," Margaret promised. "This estrangement has gone on long enough, Abby. Perhaps we both needed a sign." Her eyes flicked to the fiddle in Grace's arms, and Abigail understood what remained unspoken. Whatever had brought them together, coincidence, fate, or something more mysterious, it had created an opportunity to mend what had been broken, not just for the children but for the sisters as well. The decision crystallized in Abigail's mind with surprising clarity. These children needed her. Perhaps, though she had been slow to admit it, she needed them too. "Very well," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "We'll try together." The cabin, which had known only solitude and silence for so long, suddenly filled with a different kind of sound. William's whoop of joy, Thomas's relieved exhale, Dr. Chen's approving murmur, and from Grace, the first true words Abigail had, heard her speak directly to her. "Thank you, grandmother." The title, offered without hesitation or question, pierced Abigail to her core. Not Mrs. Thornwood, not Abigail, but grandmother, a role she had never expected to fill again after her son's death. Outside, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing. The horses stamped and snorted in the cold, their breath creating plumes of white mist. The riders who had made the impossible journey through the blizzard moved efficiently around the shed, establishing a temporary camp with practiced ease. And inside the cabin, something new took root, a fragile, tentative connection between broken souls who had somehow found each other across impossible distances. A family, unconventional and unexpected, forged not through blood, but through shared survival and chosen kinship. Margaret reached across the space between them and touched Abigail's arm, the first physical contact between the sisters in 20 years. "Welcome back to the world, Abby," she said softly. Abigail didn't pull away. Instead, she covered her sister's hand with her own, feeling the weight of years between them, but also the possibility of reconciliation. "I never left the world, Maggie," she replied. "I just found a different part of it." As the day progressed into evening, the inhabitants of the cabin and their visitors settled into an uneasy but hopeful coexistence. Plans were made, arrangements discussed. The children would stay with Abigail, with regular visits from Margaret and trips to Pine Ridge when weather permitted. Samuel promised to return in spring with materials to expand the cabin, another room for the boys, perhaps a proper kitchen. And through it all, Grace sat quietly with the fiddle in her lap, occasionally running her small fingers over its strings, producing formless melodies that nevertheless seemed to carry echoes of something older, something that spoke of continuity and connection across the barriers of time and death. That night, as the visitors slept in the shed and the children in their pallet by the fire, Abigail stood at the window, looking out at the star-strewn sky above her mountain. For the first time in decades, the solitude she had cultivated so carefully didn't feel like protection. It felt like a door long closed that was finally beginning to open. "Marcus," she whispered to the night, to the stars, to whatever might be listening beyond the veil of the visible world. "I think I understand now. I think I'm ready." As if in answer, A breath of wind stirred the wind chimes hanging from the porch eaves. Chimes Marcus had carved from cedar wood the summer before. He died. Their gentle music blended with the natural sounds of the mountain night, creating a harmony that spoke of belonging, of homecoming, of the connections that transcend even death itself. Abigail closed her eyes and listened, truly listened for the first time in years. And in that moment of openness, she could almost believe she heard fiddle music playing softly beneath the wind's song. Not a ghost's lament, but a gentle welcome home. The weeks following the arrival of Margaret and her companions brought changes to Abigail's mountain that went beyond the gradual shift from winter to spring. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, had become a hub of activity, not just from the children who now called it home, but from the steady stream of visitors who made the journey up from Pine Ridge whenever weather permitted. Samuel Green had been true to his word. As soon as the heaviest snows melted, he arrived with a wagon laden with lumber, tools, and 4 strong men eager to work. Within a fortnight, the cabin had gained 2 new rooms, one for the boys and a smaller one for Grace. The original space was transformed into a proper kitchen and living area, with windows that welcomed the strengthening spring sunlight. Dr. Chen visited monthly, bringing medicines, books, and news from town. She took a particular interest in William, whose curious mind and endless questions about her medical bag suggested a potential vocation. "That boy has a healer's hands," she told Abigail, "and a mind quick enough to match them." And Margaret, true to her promise, came most frequently of all. The 20-year estrangement between the sisters dissolved not in dramatic reconciliation, but in the practical work of raising 3 children on a remote mountain. They still disagreed, often and vigorously, about everything from education to discipline to the proper way to preserve blackberries, but beneath the familiar friction lay a renewed respect, a recognition of the strength that had carried each of them through decades of separate griefs. Today, as April sunlight spilled across the newly green clearing around the cabin, Abigail stood on the expanded porch and watched Thomas and William splitting logs. The winter's ordeal had transformed the boys. Thomas had gained weight and height, his lanky frame filling out with the muscle that came from daily physical labor. William, always the slighter of the two, had developed a wiry strength and confidence that showed in his straight posture and ready smile. They had chosen to stay on the mountain for Easter rather than make the trip to Pine Ridge, a decision that warmed Abigail in ways she hadn't expected. The frozen ground behind the cabin now held a small grave for their father, finally retrieved from the ravine and properly buried once the spring thaw allowed. The children had grieved openly, their tears no longer frozen by shock or displacement, and had begun the slow process of truly healing. Grace emerged from the cabin, carrying a basket of early spring flowers she had gathered from the sheltered southern slope where snowmelt came first. Her blonde hair, longer now, was braided with the same neat precision Margaret had taught her, and she wore a new dress Abigail had sewn from fabric Margaret brought from town. "For father," she said, holding up the basket for Abigail's inspection, "and for your husband and son. Margaret says we should remember them all today." Abigail nodded, trusting her voice would hold steady despite the emotion that still caught her unawares at such moments. "That's a fine idea," she agreed. "We'll place them after dinner." Grace set the basket down and climbed onto the porch swing that Samuel had built and Thomas had hung as a surprise for Abigail's birthday last month. She held Marcus's fiddle across her lap, a constant companion she rarely set aside. "Will you teach me to play soon?" she asked. "I'm almost 6 now." "When your hands are a bit larger," Abigail promised. In truth, she barely knew how to play herself, having spent the winter evenings fumbling through half-remembered melodies while Margaret, surprisingly, provided accompaniment on a harmonica she'd carried since childhood. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider approached, from the trail, moving at a comfortable trot. Abigail recognized the horse before the rider, Margaret's grey gelding, distinctive for the white blaze down its face. "Margaret is early," Abigail commented, shading her eyes against the sun. "She wasn't expected until tomorrow." Thomas and William paused in their work, waving as the rider drew closer, but as the figure came into clearer view, Abigail realized it wasn't Margaret at all, but a young woman with auburn hair escaping from beneath her hat, her slim form wrapped in a riding coat too large for her frame. "Hannah," Grace whispered, rising from the swing so abruptly that the fiddle nearly fell. "Hannah's come." Before Abigail could question who Hannah might be, Grace was racing down the porch steps and across the clearing toward the approaching rider. The young woman dismounted swiftly and knelt to catch Grace in an embrace that spoke of deep familiarity and affection. "You know her?" Abigail asked Thomas, who had moved to stand beside her. He nodded, a complex emotion crossing his face. "Hannah Miller, Aunt Eliza's daughter. She helped care for Grace after Mother died." His voice held a note of guarded happiness. "I didn't think she'd come." The young woman approached with Grace, clinging to her hand, her face alight with a smile that transformed her from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. She couldn't have been more than 20, with intelligent eyes and a confident bearing that reminded Abigail of Margaret in her younger years. "Mrs. Thornwood," she greeted, extending her free hand. "I'm Hannah Miller. Margaret, Mrs. Blackwood, said I might find my 3 favorite people with you." Abigail accepted the handshake, noting the calluses that spoke of work rather than leisure. "You've saved me from having to learn the fiddle," she said dryly. "Grace has been persistent in her requests." Hannah laughed, a warm sound that seemed to brighten the already sunny day. "I taught her father to play. It seems only right I should teach his daughter." She glanced around at the cabin, the new additions, the carefully tended garden beds prepared for planting. "You've created something wonderful here." "We all have," Abigail corrected, surprising herself with the ease of including others in what had once been her solitary domain. "You're welcome to stay if you'd like to. There's room now." William appeared at Hannah's side, tugging at her coat. "Did you bring the books? You promised." "In my saddlebag," Hannah confirmed. 3 new ones, just as I said." As William darted off to investigate this treasure, Thomas approached more slowly, his expression carefully composed. "Hello, Hannah," he said, his voice deeper than usual. "You look well." Something passed between the 2 young people, a current of awareness that made Abigail suddenly conscious of Thomas's age. At 12, he stood on the cusp of adolescence, no longer quite a child, but not yet a man, and Hannah, though young, looked at him with a warmth that transcended the gap in their years. "As do you, Thomas," Hannah replied. "Margaret said you've become quite the mountain man." A flush crept up Thomas's neck, but he stood straighter, pride evident in his posture. "I've been learning. Mrs. Thornwood, Abigail, is a good teacher." Watching them, Abigail was struck by the connections spreading outward from the single point of the children's arrival in her life. Hannah, Margaret, Dr. Chen, Samuel, a web of relationships expanding to include her isolated mountain in its weave. "Come inside," she invited. "We were about to prepare dinner, and I suspect you have news from town that would interest us all." Hannah's smile dimmed slightly. "I do," she admitted. "Some of it difficult, I'm afraid." Later, after a meal where William chattered enough for all of them, and Grace refused to let Hannah out of arm's reach, the adults sat on the porch while the younger children examined the books Hannah had brought. The evening air carried the scent of pine and the first wildflowers, with just enough chill to remind them that winter had not fully released its grip on the mountains. "Mother is selling the boarding house," Hannah said, delivering the news she had carried from Pine Ridge. "Her health isn't what it was. The doctor, your Dr. Chen, says the damp is making her lungs worse." "I'm sorry to hear it," Abigail said, genuinely concerned for the woman who had been prepared to take in 3 orphaned children despite her own difficulties. "Where will she go?" "West," Hannah replied. "To Arizona Territory. My brother settled there last year and says the dry air is a balm for ailments like hers." She hesitated, glancing at Thomas, who sat slightly apart, his attention seemingly focused on the knife he was sharpening. "I'll be going with her, at least until she's settled." Thomas's hand stilled momentarily, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "When do you leave?" he asked, not looking up. "After midsummer," Hannah said. "Once the passes are fully clear." She turned to Abigail. "I wanted to spend as much time here as possible before then, to help with Grace's reading, and to make sure you had everything you needed for the children." Abigail heard what remained unsaid: Hannah's reluctance to leave, her concern for the children who had already experienced so much loss, perhaps especially her growing attachment to Thomas, the complexity of human connections, their fragility, and their strength struck Abigail anew. These children had brought life back to her mountain, had forced her heart to expand beyond the narrow confines of solitary grief. But with connection came vulnerability, the risk of new losses, new pain. Yet looking at Thomas's rigid control, at William's absorption in his books, at Grace leaning trustingly against Hannah's side, Abigail knew she would not trade this newfound family for the safety of isolation. Not anymore. "We'll manage," she said with quiet certainty. "And Arizona isn't the end of the world. There are letters, visits." She met Hannah's eyes directly. "You'll always have a place here, whenever you can return." Relief and gratitude washed across the young woman's face. "Thank you," she whispered. Later, after Hannah had settled into the small guest room and the children were asleep, Abigail sat alone on the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast mountain sky like diamond dust. From inside the cabin came the soft rhythmic breathing of souls at rest, trusting in their safety beneath her roof. She thought of Marcus, of their son, of the years she had spent in frozen grief, unwilling to move forward, to create new connections, to risk her heart again. She remembered the blizzard that had delivered 3 lost children to her door, the mysterious music that had guided them, the inexplicable reappearance of a buried fiddle. "I understand now," she whispered to the night, to whoever might be listening. "Beyond the veil of stars. Life doesn't end with loss. It changes, becomes something different than we imagined. But it continues, like music that shifts from a dirge to a reel without ever falling silent." As if in answer, a gentle breeze stirred. The wind chimes, creating a melody that blended with the natural sounds of the mountain night. And beneath it, so faint she might have imagined it, came the distant notes of a fiddle, not mournful now but joyful, a celebration of all that had been lost and all that had been found. Abigail smiled and closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. The mountain had taken much from her over the years, but in its harsh, beautiful way, it had finally given something back. Not just survival, but the chance to truly live again. Spring had returned to the mountain, and with it, the promise of new beginnings, unexpected journeys, and a family forged not through blood, but through the stronger bonds of chosen love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.